excited to be kind of testing this whole online program. So as you clearly see in front of you, the presentation is bird photography, and so we're going to be going over everything from the settings of your camera to what are some of the common terminology that you hear, and then how does this actually apply to birds, and how do we use this to get
It's on your comm pilot. It switched to your comm pilot.
All right. Is everyone ready? Okay. So then I guess the first question that we need to start off with is, so my computer, there we go. Why are we photographing birds? Like why do we do this? Like what are some of the reasons that you'd want to take your camera out birding? And the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is probably document rarities. This is by no means any award-winning beautiful photo, but this was all the proof that my friend and I needed a few years ago for a thick-billed mirror that we found in New Hampshire. Another thing is if you can get photos of the same bird over time, you can study the plumage of birds. This was the famous great blackhawk from Maine 2 years ago that you're able to see the difference in plumage between when Nick photographed it back in August and then when my friend Alex photographed it in December. You can see the molt pattern and how that bird started to gain more of its black feathers as time went on. And since this is the only individual of this species in the country at the time, your photographs of this bird over the course of the several months that it was around show how that bird was molting and allowed us to study it further. The other form is that we can use it as a personal enjoyment or an art form, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Is specifically, how do we make our own photos better, whether we're taking them for our own pleasure, to share with others, or even potentially to sell. So when you look at your camera, you're going to see a lot of settings similar to this, and whether you're Nikon or Canon, they're going to be similar with slightly different names, and I'll go over that in a second. But you have your user settings, which are they're going to be labeled as U on a Nikon or C as on Canon for customize. And it does exactly just that. You can go ahead and set a certain settings for that, and then every time you switch back to that, those are the settings that come back. So if you're working in a particular indoor studio for a while, or you're working in the same area over and over, and the lighting isn't changing, that way you can switch your camera to do other stuff in between, but always come back to those same settings. Scene is one of the automatic modes that, depending on what you're photographing, there's a portrait mode, there's a landscape mode for it. The camera will predict what settings it thinks you should use. It's a little smarter than auto in the sense that you can tell it what you're trying to photograph, but it still gives you no control over what you're doing. Auto and automatic no flash are exactly what they sound like. Camera has full control over everything, with the exception of no flash, just not using the pop-up flash on your camera. Then you're going to see within a little white line, you have manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, and program. Program is a little bit all over the place and is not very reliable to use in most cases. So we're going to focus on manual, aperture priority, and shutter priority. These are the ones that are going to give you some control, while manual gives you full control. And shutter priority on a Nikon camera is going to be denoted with an S, and on Canon it will be called TV. Aperture priority for Nikon is an A with an AV. So in all these, we're going to affect how you can adjust the exposure of your photos, which then brings up the question, what is exposure? What does that mean? You've probably heard people talk about exposing a photo correctly. And it's technically the amount of light that reaches your camera sensors at a given time. And this is affected by your shutter speed and aperture. So we'll go over what that looks like later as well. But you're going to hear people refer to a photo as being underexposed, overexposed, or exposed correctly. So what does that look like? In an underexposed photo, to put it bluntly, it's just dark. You can see that there's a lot of detail. In this photo, there's a lot of detail in the snow, but there's not much detail in the black of the bird, and the bird just looks dark overall. So if we brighten the photo a little too much, then we get overexposed, which is kind of painful to look at in this case. All the detail that you want in the black and in the beak and everything is there, but obviously you can't hardly see the bird, you can't tell what's sky, you can't tell what's snow. So you got to find the balance that gives you the nice bright look that you want for a white bird on white snow and a bright sky, but also gives you some of that detail to actually be able to see the black and the darker areas on the bird. So then what makes something a correct exposure? There's no there's no set way that applies to every photo. There'll be a correct exposure. So really what I say is that you limit the accidental clipping, and what I mean by that is keep your blacks from getting too dark with no detail in them, and keep your whites from getting too bright with no detail in them by accident. In certain cases, you can do this intentionally for a specific look of a photo, but you want to make sure you're not doing it by accident. And really, the correct exposure and everything is, you know the bird you saw, you know what it looked like around where you were, so try to make it look like that. If you know what color and brightness the setting around you was, that's what you should strive for. And you just need to know what you want to have. Like, if you have something in mind, just aim towards that. That's going to be what's correct for that photo. So the camera will also tell you what it thinks is correct, and that's in metering. So the little graphic on the right is what happens when you look through the viewfinder of your camera. You're going to see something similar to that. You're going to point the camera at something, and you're going to see this little bar move from the 0 to probably plus or minus, depending on if you're shooting something bright or dark. And that's the camera telling you that you are shooting that many stops too bright or that many stops too dark. And the way it determines that is this graphic on the left. Depending on what your metering mode is, that's what the camera is using to gauge what is the correct exposure for that photo. If you're using spot metering, then it's going to be picking whatever that center area is. That's what it's going to base the exposure around, which can oftentimes help you when you're photographing something like a bird, but in certain instances can lead you astray. Partial metering is going to consider some of the focus points around where you're shooting as well as that center one. Center weighted is going to consider the whole photo, but it's really going to put emphasis in that middle area. And then the matrix and pattern metering is going to consider the entire setting at large, and that's what it's going to use in order to help you determine your exposure. And we'll come back to this as you see what some of the exposures look like. So the first setting that's going to affect your exposure is your shutter speed, and that's the duration that the sensor is exposed to the light. And so DSLRs have what's called a rolling curtain shutter to determine how much light reaches the shutter, and I have an animation of that coming up here. And you're going to typically see it as 1 over a number, and that's going to be 1 over 100 is 1/100th of a second. Or you can even have an exposure as long as 30 seconds and as fast as 1/8000th of a second on most DSLRs. So the faster the shutter, the less time the shutter is open, which means less light can hit. But because less light hits, it can capture motion a lot quicker. And if you have a slower shutter, then the shutter is open for longer, more light can hit, but then any sort of movement is going to get caught as well. So here's what I mean by the rolling curtain. You're going to see the shutter can only move so fast. But if you look closely, and I'll let this run one more time, you can see that the width of that curtain that's open is also going to affect the speed. So if we watch this again here, you can see just that you can see that everything moved at the same rate, and I froze it here, but you can see that for each different exposure, the amount of light hitting the camera, even though it's at the same rate, that's how they are able to get it going so fast. But on these slower shutter speeds, like 1/100th of a second, you can't really capture movement. The bird is blurry, the wings are not really even visible hardly, the tail is very blurry because this bird was moving very fast. But when you get the opportunity to shoot at higher shutter speeds, you're able to freeze a bird in motion and with water droplets. But birds often move so quickly that you can even see the tips of the wings still aren't quite sharp, just showing that sometimes these birds are moving so quickly that it can be really hard to capture that movement. But on the other end, if you leave your shutter open for a very long time, you get the opportunity to photograph things that you may not even be able to capture or be able to see with your eyes. If you leave it open long enough in areas where there's no light pollution, then you're going to be able to see stars that you can't even see with your naked eye. And these are typically called long exposure photos. And these were taken up in a more remote part of Minnesota earlier this summer. The next setting that is going to affect exposure is aperture, and that is the opening of the lens's diaphragm that light can pass through, and this is called your f-stop. A lower f-stop is a larger opening, which then means more light can come in. It compresses your background and gives you a more shallow depth of field. And then if the number is higher, you have a more narrow opening, less light can get through, and there's less compression and depth of field to the photo. And while it may make sense that always shoot at the lowest aperture you can, sometimes that will change, or actually it can change greatly depending on the distance of your subject. So in this case, you can see the difference between f2.8, only the close flowers in focus and everything else is out of focus. And then at f6.3, you can see significantly more detail in some of the other flowers as well. And this shows that as you increase that number, you can see more detail further back in the photo as that depth of field increases. However, this is all assuming you stay the same distance away from your subject. The same f-stop at different distances, can give you the same effect. If you're closer to a subject, like the cardinal on the left, even the upper part of the breast of the bird and the legs are not in focus, because this bird was probably 5 or 6 feet away from me, whereas this Arctic tern on the right was considerably further, and you can even start to make out some of the detail in the background there and all of the setting that it's standing on. So even if you get close to your subject at the same aperture, you will get more compression. So ISO is another setting that you'll commonly hear about, and this is not part of your exposure because it doesn't directly affect how much light is hitting your sensor. What's happening is it's the way the camera is interpreting the data coming from the pixels. It'll amplify that, and that's what's going to alter the colors and give you a noisy look to your photo. Originally, the ISO sensitivity was the amount of silver nitrate present on a film strip. So when you bought more sensitive film, it had more of the silver nitrate present on it, which reacted more intensely with light, therefore allowing for a more sensitive film. And so the way you can set this is there's often an ISO button. On some cameras it's on the back, some cameras have it on the top, but it'll almost always say ISO very blatantly. And what this looks like is you can see higher ISOs have significant amount of noise to them, such as the whiskered screech owl photo on the right, and you don't really notice it as much in the loon. It certainly becomes more prevalent when you begin to crop, especially. And so shooting at the lower ISO will give you the less noise, but it also is going to limit the sensitivity of your light, so therefore you may not be able to get that faster shutter speed that you're looking for. So although it doesn't affect the amount of light hitting your sensor, it's also part of this trade-off that you have to consider when balancing settings. And so here's a little graphic that shows aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, and the relative difference of them as you alter them. And so I'm not going to go too in depth with this, but stops are the unit that we measure exposure. So you'll often hear someone say, like, if you raise something, or you raise your shutter speed, a stop, they're all measured different depending on what setting it is. And really the important thing to take away now is that you can have a different shutter speed and aperture combination that gives you the exact same exposure as another one does, because they're a constant trade-off between the two, and those are called equivalent exposures. But that's just what the term stop means. Once you get into the very detailed stuff of measuring stops like this, that's a lot more commonly used in studios with using external lighting and everything. So then exposure compensation, as Brian put it when I was talking with him, is helping you make your camera meter smarter. And like I said, the camera is going to predict what it thinks is the brightest, or what it thinks it wants to expose correctly based on what it sees and how it interprets everything. But sometimes it might not be exactly what you're aiming for. And I'll go over what that looks like here in a second. But exposure compensation is going to allow you to tell the camera that you want your photo to be this many stops brighter or darker than what it's telling you based on the subject that you're looking at. So here's an example of broad-billed hummingbird, and this is all going to be at a consistent aperture and consistent ISO, and we're in aperture priority mode with an exposure comp of 0. This is the photo we're getting. If we were to tell the camera to to make the photo stop brighter by increasing our exposure compensation, this would be the resulting image we would get. If we were back at that exposure comp of 0 and we turned, the exposure comp of 0 and we went down to -1 stop, this is going to be the resulting image that we would get from that, assuming no other settings change, because the camera is metering for what it thinks, and then you're going to tell it otherwise. And really, this gets to be useful when you're shooting something against a lighter background. Like this bird here, the spectacled eider is against a bright white background as a white bird, but has a lot of darker detail to it. So when you have a lighter background like this, the camera is going to expose for that because that's going to be most of what it sees is bright. And your subject is dark. So when the camera is going to tell you, hey, this is a really bright setting, I think you should meter depth. I think you should underexpose a little bit so you don't lose detail in that background. But then you know you're going to lose all that detail in the bird. So you're actually going to raise your exposure comp up to cancel that out so you still get a nice balance between detail and the darker and lighter points of your photo. And Canon is going to typically use more plus compensation than Nikon cameras will. On the other hand, when you have a very dark setting with a lighter bird on it, the camera is going to try to brighten that. It's going to try to tell you to brighten that background to make it expose correctly. But when you have any sort of dark setting with a bright bird and it tries to brighten that up, you're going to lose a lot of detail on that bird because it's going to be way too bright. So you're going to actually want to lower your exposure compensation in order to keep that bird from getting too bright from what the camera is telling you to do. So now those are all like the basic settings and how they look. We're going to get into what does it look like when you actually start doing this with birds. So one thing, once you have an understanding of how to balance your different settings and everything, we're going to look into how to compose your photos and what sort of things you need to take into consideration when you're working with birds. So we're going to go over the angle that light is coming at, the wind direction, how to frame the photo, what angle you should be photographing birds at for different looks, as well as inclusion of habitat in your photos. So when looking at light angle, you can see the light's coming in from the top right of this bird. The shadow is being cast pretty strong underneath him, which means it's a relatively direct light. There's detail there. It's not really the most flattering light. It starts to do weird things in areas that are being shadowed. It's just all around not as flattering. But in this case, you also had light coming from directly above the bird, and that can be seen in the reflections of the water droplets on them, as well as the bright spots on the beak. But this was shot on a cloudy day, and so that cloud is going to diffuse the light. It's going to give you a much softer light. There's not really as many harsh shadows, and it's an all-around more flattering light to the bird. So keeping in mind what direction the light is coming from to give you the most flattering option possible with these birds. The next thing to consider is the direction of the wind. In many cases, when you're photographing, whether it's shorebirds or waterfowl or anything that's going to just pick up and leave really quickly, they're oftentimes going to take off into the wind because they need that to get the lift. So if you're able to predict that and get the wind in a direction that you want, then if that bird does happen to take off, you have an idea of where it's going. You can already be one step ahead of it, ready to get that flight shot that you're looking for. So in this case, the wind was coming from this direction, and we could tell that when we were out. So as we watched this eider, we could tell as the Jaegers were flying around that it was going to pick up and fly away. We were already able to start panning our camera over to the left to start tracking that flight. When you get the light and the wind both coming from the same direction behind you, you're going to be able to have birds coming in, taking off, and landing right at you, such as these lesser scops. So considering that, along with light, you're able to really predict what sorts of behaviors the birds are going to do if they're going to leave any rapid time. So when it comes to actually framing the photos, there's several different ways you can frame it. I mean, here are some examples of having a tall shot vertical with a bird stretching in it. We have a head shot. We have a bird tiny in the frame like the snowy plover, as well as a centered bird stretching like the great blue heron there. And the first thing to consider is the angle at which you're photographing. It can be really easy to get excited and just start taking a bunch of photos like this. I mean, this is a relatively clear, good identifiable photo of this pectoral sandpiper. But if you anytime you have the opportunity to get down at eye level with the bird, then that's going to dramatically change the setting that you have. This suddenly becomes a much more almost like personable photo. Like you have a much better like connection to this bird while you're laying there on its level. You can see things, you just see it in a way that you don't normally see, and it makes for an all-around more lively looking photo, in my opinion. So I was able to get this photo of my sister laying down up in Rocky Mountain National Park, photographing a white-tailed ptarmigan, and the resulting photo gives a nice eye-level photo that it just beats looking down on a bird that's walking across the ground. And when you're looking at these, in this photo, you can see it a little bit with all the rocks, is to consider the habitat in the photos. If you have the opportunity to shoot a little bit wider and give some of that setting, it gives them more of an understanding to the birds, and you have an idea of just more of like the life history about the bird, and I think it just adds overall to be able to see some of that setting as well. That's personal preference, but it's certainly something to consider when you're composing these photos. So we just spent all this time towards the beginning of talking about these rules of photography, these settings of make sure that you're considering this so you don't get too slow of a shutter speed, or you don't want the ISO too high or else you're going to start to get noise and stuff like that. But why do we have these rules of photography? And that's so you know when to break them and how to break them. Knowing how to use your camera and what settings to do are going to allow for unlimited opportunities, because there is a massive difference between unintentionally breaking these rules and intentionally breaking them. So we've been talking about, for example, if you were to go shoot with the light angle directly on the bird and it's diffused, you're not overexposing or underexposing any of these particular areas. If these are the rules, then what does it look like if you go and you break all of these rules? Like, what can you do with that? And if you're not careful, you get this. You get a photo where this woodpecker has a bunch of very dark spots that you can't really see any detail in. You have some bright spots on the right side of the bark there. There's not much detail on the bird. It's kind of hard to even see what it is at first. Or you get something like this grackle where, because exposure compensation wasn't used, the camera saw that bright background, or the camera actually was metering for the dark bird, and it tried to brighten that bird up a lot so you could see all the detail of a grackle. And because it did that, it completely blew out all of the bright spots on this bird, or on this setting, and therefore completely ruined the photo. But if you do all this knowing what you're going for, and you can actually strategically do all this, it really can do some amazing things. And I use this photo because all of the things that we talked about in those last two photos there are prevalent again here. You have a direct, undiffused light source coming in directly on the bird. Even from the back, the light angle is not even in the direction that you're shooting from. You have a completely blown out area in the neck of the bird there, and the blacks around the face are very, very dark. But because you know what you're doing with this, you're able to catch this backlighting that perfectly illuminates all of the leaves of the branch of that mesquite tree, as well as highlights all those bright feathers of the bird, making a very, very nice setting. And the same worked with this pectoral sandpiper, having the light directly behind it. We were able to backlight snow, as well as get all those grasses glowing and everything, and add it for a very warm, almost surreal feel to it, because it was a beautiful golden hour lighting. Also, it allows you to photograph birds in silhouette, which can sometimes look cool in large flocks, like these dunlin from Lake Erie a few years ago. And just keeping all of this in mind and utilizing all these settings, and now that knowing what they do and what effect they have on a photo, getting that down will allow you to use them in ways that typically don't seem right, and allow for some of these more creative photo opportunities. So I know a lot of people, when they're getting into serious bird photography, they had they had a camera that they used for a while and they really liked it and they want to get further into it. So I'm just going to briefly touch on what the difference is in some of these cameras and how they affect bird photography. So when people ask you what's the right camera for bird photography, the most important thing to consider is your budget, because that's really going to limit some opportunities, but you have great options at all levels. You really need to know what sort of thing you plan to do with it. Right now, all the talk is about mirrorless versus DSLR, crop versus full frame. Are more megapixels better? Do you really need to go full frame? And so just to briefly cover the differences in these cameras, a DSLR has a mirror inside of it that reflects light to the viewfinder. So when you look through the viewfinder, you're essentially looking down the lens of your camera, and the mirror will flip up and the shutter opens and light can hit the sensor directly. So when you take a picture on a DSLR and all of a sudden the viewfinder goes black for a second, the mirror's flipped up so no light's hitting your viewfinder, and that's why you're not seeing anything. On a mirrorless, the light is hitting the sensor directly, and it allows you to have a digital preview of what your photo looks like. So as you go altering your settings, then you're able to see sort of prediction as to what that looks like. And so some of the pros and cons is mirrorless cameras are typically smaller, they're more lightweight, they have that digital preview that allows you to see essentially what you're going to get before you actually take the photo. And because it's all relatively new and it's being done by a lot of different companies, there's easy conversion to different brand lenses, so you don't really have to limit yourself as much. The pros of a DSLR is they're durable, they have a really long battery life. There's a well-established line of lenses because it's been the common camera for the longest time now. And it allows you to look down the lens and see in real time what's happening without having any sort of digital preview or delay that may arise from that. And the larger body is going to allow for more convenient placing of settings. If you have these bigger cameras, then you have a lot more buttons at your disposal that you can use for adjusting your settings quicker. And there's a little link there that I'd be happy to send out to anyone if they look with a more in-depth look between the two, if that's something that you're ever considering. And just a disclaimer that both of these make great photos, and it ultimately comes down to your preference and how you plan to use it. If you're looking for something just to carry around while you're out birding all the time, something lightweight and quick like a mirrorless may be the right option. And familiarity is also big on this. So the difference in crop sensor and full frame sensor, which is commonly something you'll hear about. A crop sensor has a tighter view at the same distance. It essentially allows for extra reach for further subjects. If you put the same lens on a full frame and crop body, a 300 millimeter lens on a crop body is essentially going to be a 450 millimeter lens, using like the standard size that crop sensors are. On a full frame, you have a much wider view at that same distance. It's a larger sensor, allowing for significantly more light to hit the sensor and more quality available. It's going to be much better in low light, and they do have a more shallow depth of field. So you can see in the photo comparing the Nikon D5200 and D610 here, you can see the difference in size of those sensors. And I have the graphic below. The white and orange squares represent the difference in that sensor size as well. So you can see just how much more space you get on a full frame. But then if you look at that compared to a micro four thirds, which is also what a lot of mirrorless cameras currently use, you can see that if someone was standing next to me with a crop sensor camera and a mirrorless camera, and we all had the same zoom lens, you can see what each of our photos would have turned out like. So in this particular case, it may look obvious to go full frame because you would have lost so many birds. But oftentimes, a lot of people like the crop sensor having that extra reach for when they're photographing one individual bird at a distance. And again, this all comes down to preference and will allow you to have more options when you're out shooting. So tips when we're actually out in the field and trying to apply this to birds specifically is just to consider the right equipment. Whether you're using your camera strap or if you're using a heavier lens, maybe consider a sling so that the weight isn't attached to the camera body itself. carrying a tripod if you're going to be in one spot for too long, or you want that extra stability, or you're walking through conditions where you need some extra support for yourself. Tripod can be good there. Considering the weight of your lens and the zoom of your lens, you don't really want to carry a super heavy lens if you're going out on a several mile hike just to go birding. That can get very tiring. And note, an important thing to consider is to know the limits. Just make sure you respect the bird. If the bird seems stressed, don't push it any further. You don't want to risk stressing out birds for this. Respect other people. If you're in a crowd and a bunch of people are looking at a bird, make sure you respect other people. You don't want to do anything to jeopardize that bird flying off or to jeopardize someone else's experience. You don't want someone to completely not even see it because you may be in the way trying to get that perfect photo. And that doesn't commonly happen, but I've seen it enough that I just feel it important to say. And respect the environment. If you find yourself damaging surroundings or going into areas where you're not supposed to, don't push it. You don't want to jeopardize anything with that as well. But yeah, actually, when it comes to engaging with birds, approaching the birds can be a lot easier than you think. And it's really hard to explain without being in the field with a small group, but the ability to read birds' behavior and use that in order to just allow them to be comfortable with you. Oftentimes, shorebirds are the first example that comes to my mind. They have behaviors that they do whenever they're stressed. If you start seeing shorebirds bobbing their heads, I often just stop where I'm at, maybe back up a little bit and let them calm back down. If birds are preening or sleeping, then they're not really concerned to you. Or if they're hunting, they're not really concerned to you. And you can just gauge that behavior to make sure you're not causing any stress to those birds. And once they become comfortable around you, it can allow for some amazing photo opportunities. And you want to make sure you set yourself up in the right position. And this photo always makes me laugh. It's Brian and I climbed down these rocks in order to get ourselves at that lowest angle possible to get right at the water level, so that we had the opportunity to photograph thick-billed mirror, black-legged kittiwake. But we had to set ourselves up for that. We weren't going to get the same shot if we'd stayed up on that pier originally. So it may take some things like that if you're willing to. Another example is wading out in chest-deep water with ice floating around to be able to get some photos of Pacific loons. Depending on what bird you're going for, it may allow for some very interesting experiences to get yourself in position for it. Or setting yourself up in a spot where we had decoys here and we were trying to attract waterfowl for waterfowl photography. And so we were able to set up everything right where we wanted to be. We knew where the light and the wind were coming from. So we were able to put the decoys out accordingly and position ourselves and just wait. And then as time went on, we had the opportunity to photograph several of these ducks. And then when it comes to setting yourself up, I wanted to bring up this last example as how another opportunity for going against what you think with bird photography and going against these rules that you think of. Oftentimes people are going to tell you that the more focal distance that you can have, the better bird photos you're going to get. If you have an 800 millimeter lens, you're going to get a lot closer, better photos of a bird than you did if you had 100 millimeters. But again, as long as you know what bird you're working with and you know what you have at your disposal for your camera, then you can make some really amazing photos. And thankfully, my dad captured this photo of me with my 15 millimeter lens in front of a pelican this past December. This pelican was on a pier down in Destin, Florida. It's fed by fishermen every day. This bird will actually approach you if you don't approach it first. So it's not like I was really causing any stress to the bird. The bird was very curious in my lens. It actually bit at my lens hood a little bit. But using a 15 millimeter lens and actually going to an aperture of f14, which is typically a lot more narrow than I typically shoot at, it allowed for some really, really cool photos to be taken. So you always have the opportunity to take these sort of bird photos as long as you just know know your camera, know your ability, know what the bird is doing, and again, just know how to break these rules of photography that you commonly hear, but know why you're doing it. And that's going to ultimately help you to take the best photos that you can. So with that, I'm going to open up to any questions that people have. If anyone has any questions about specific cameras, specific settings, instances that they've been out shooting, that questions came up that they want to talk to us about? No questions? Or I guess everyone's muted.
Well, everyone can unmute if they need to.
Mm-hmm.
I guess no questions for you, Tyler.
Oh.
You covered it all.
Can't tell if someone's waving or...
Yeah. Julie has a question.
Julie's waving.
I should be able to
Julie
unmute.
All right. I wasn't looking at participants
There we
there.
go. Julie, you should be unmuted now.
Okay. Tyler, when you're shooting birds in flight,
Mm-hmm.
should I be like my AF mode? Should I be in dynamic or stay in single point, 3D tracking, or auto?
So, yeah, every camera is going to have different modes, and a lot of the newer cameras have a lot more to them. I actually just keep mine in the basic. It's on Nikon. It's called autofocus continuous servo mode. I don't have things like that dynamic tracking or the multiple group tracking available to me on the body that I use. I'm not. What are you on, Nikon or Canon?
Yeah, I got a Nikon D50-100.
Okay.
And I keep it on continuous, but I didn't know if I should be looking at the other options or not.
Continuous is what I've used. That seems to be most common across the body, so that's what I would trust personally.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
All right, well, that seems to be it. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening. Tyler will do another program next Monday. And Tyler, what is that program?
It is bird photo editing. Oh, I did see I got a question come in from the chat.
Oh, okay.
So I'll address that after. So the program, it's an unofficial follow, like it makes for a good follow-up to this, but it also works as a standalone, and it's bird photo editing. So we're going to talk about all the basic tools that editing softwares have and how to improve the photos when they come off your camera to when you're able to share them.
Awesome.
And so the question I got in the chat was the most memorable bird photography experience, and that is, I was trying to think about that earlier because I was worried I'd get that question because I have so many opportunities, because I think of things like even just this Parula and the Redbud was because of classes being canceled. It was just very, very cool to get to spend that time with my sister. Like, that was very memorable to me, getting to go out and shoot every morning with her all spring migration. But also, thanks to shooting with Brian, I don't think I can beat being in waders up in Alaska photographing loons and eiders. I think that would have to be my favorite. We did have an opportunity to watch a group of king eiders while I was out in waders and watch them bringing food back to the female on the nest, and getting to see king eider nests was pretty amazing. So that would probably be my most memorable experience.
I'm not sure if Tyler can hear me.
I can hear.
We can hear you.
Hey, Tyler, to quote you directly, literally every day you said, "Oh my God, this is the coolest thing I've ever done," during the whole week of Barrow.
Yeah, I think definitely the first time I was there, every bird I was photographing became the new coolest opportunity I had. And then going into leading that trip the next year, I thought I was prepared and everything, and still from the next time I got there, everything I saw became the next coolest thing I'd ever seen. Like that area specifically never ceases to amaze me. I guess an easy answer would just be, say, Barrow is my most memorable birding story. Everything that happens there is nothing short of magical. The photography up there.
Nice. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this evening. And Tyler, thanks for a great program. Hopefully the recording of this worked and it will be available on our website soon, but I am not. This is the first time I've tried to record a Zoom program, so we'll see what happens.
All right.
Thanks everyone for joining us tonight, and have a great evening, and we'll see everyone soon.
Awesome.